Hi, everybody. It's Neil, and I have a new reading for you today. In honor of Mental Health Month, I'm going to be reading from Challenger Deep. Uh, now, what I've chosen to do with this reading is I'm going to read you some random chapters. Now, Challenger Deep has has a whole lot of these very small random chapters that are sort of just observations on life that don't fit within the narrative, but are just the character's observations on his life in the world. And so they all kind of stand out separate and apart from the story, but also fit within the framework of the story as he's telling it. So I'm going to just be going randomly through and reading these, and just things to think about. I'm going to start with chapter 32, Less Than Nothing. I read somewhere that they're going to be doing away with pennies entirely one of these days, because I guess thoughts are all they're good for. Bank accounts will be rounded to the nearest nickel, fountains will reject copper, purchases will be required by law to end in either 0 or 5, nothing in between will be allowed. Except that there is something in between, even if everyone denies it. It's like all those subway tokens that became obsolete when New York started using magnetic cards instead. No one knew what to do with those tokens. It was like this dragon's hoard of worthless brass that not even Smog's underachieving brother would want. And with real estate being so expensive in the city, the cost of storing them was probably astronomical. I'll bet they just hired the mafia to dump them in the East River along with the body of whatever city planner thought Metro cards was a good idea. If pennies become worthless, does that devalue our thoughts to less than nothing? It makes me sad to think about it. Billions of copper bits spinning down the yellow funnel into oblivion. I wonder where they'll go. All those thoughts have to end up somewhere. Chapter 45, 10 Graves Deep. How unlucky does a kid have to be to fall in an abandoned well? You hear these stories all the time. Some kid's playing out in a field somewhere with his dog, and down he goes, 50 feet or more, vanishing into nowhere. If the kid is lucky, and the dog isn't too stupid, people find out in time and they get someone with no collarbones to go down the well and fish the kid out. Then the no collarbones guy gets to spend the rest of his life feeling there was a reason he was born with no discernible shoulders, and the rescued kid gets to pass his genetic material on to future generations. If the kid isn't lucky, then he dies down there, and the tale ends sadly. What must it be like to suddenly be swallowed by the earth, finding oneself nearly 10 graves deep? What thoughts go through a person's mind? Man, this sucks, doesn't quite cover it. There are times I feel like I'm the kid screaming at the bottom of the well, and my dog runs off to pee on trees instead of getting help. Chapter 50, Garage Widows. Not all spiders have perfect webs. Black widows don't. There are black widows in our garage, or at least there were before the house was tented. But even if they're gone, they'll be back faster than the termites. Black widows are easy to identify. A red hourglass design on their bellies. They're hard and shiny. They look almost like plastic Halloween spiders. They're not as deadly as people think. Without anti-venom, you might lose a limb at worst. It would take 3 or 4 bites from different spiders to kill a full-grown human. The thing is, though, they're shy spiders. They don't bite easily. They'd rather just be left alone. Very reclusive. Ironically, it's the brown recluse spider that's aggressive and will go after you. Their venom is pretty deadly. I always know when there's a black widow in the garage because of the web. Black widow webs are messy. No pattern. Like whatever mechanism in their tiny brains that makes webs is broken. They lack the engineering skill to make picture-perfect fly-catching nets. Or maybe they just can't be bothered. Maybe they embrace the randomness. Maybe the lines they draw have meaning to them that the rest of the arachnid world is blind to. For this reason, I have more than the usual amount of sympathy when I crush them with my shoe. Chapter 53, Hindsight at My Feet. On the way to school a few years ago, Dad had an unusual freak-out moment. Usually because any time my dad freaks out, it's as predictable as the tax table, but this was something new. Mackenzie, my sister, was in the back, and I was riding shotgun. From the moment we left the driveway, Dad was jittery, like he had had too much coffee. I figured it was something to do with work until he let out an unsettled sigh and said, "Something's wrong." I didn't say anything. I just waited for him to explain, because he never says anything provocative without explaining himself. Mackenzie, however, doesn't have patience to wait. "What's wrong with what?" she asked. "Nothing," Dad said. "I don't know." He was distracted enough to miss a yellow light and had to slam on the brakes to keep from careening into the intersection as the light turned red. He looked at the cars around us nervously and said, "I'm just having trouble driving today." I started to worry that maybe he was having a heart attack or a stroke or something. But before I voiced my concerns, I noticed something at my feet right next to my backpack. It was a metallic and oddly shaped thing, but it was only odd because of its location. It was a common enough object, but you generally don't see such a thing lying on the floor. Only after I picked it up did I realize what it was. "Dad?" He glanced over to me, saw what I was holding, and all of his anxiety melted in a single short laugh of recognition. Well, that would explain things, wouldn't it? Mackenzie leaned forward from her spot in the back seat. "What is it?" I showed it to her. "The rear view mirror," I told her. Dad pulled over to the side of the road to readjust himself mentally to the idea of driving without being able to see instantly behind him. I remember looking at the adhesive pad on the windshield where the mirror should have been and shaking my head like my father was clueless. "How could you not know it was gone?" Dad shrugged. "Driving's automatic," he said. "You don't think about those things. All I knew was that I somehow felt impaired." I didn't get it at the time, but that feeling, knowing something is wrong but not being able to pinpoint what it is a feeling I've come to know intimately. The difference is I've never been able to find something as easy and as obvious as a rear-view mirror lying at my feet. Chapter 58, Headbanger. There was this kid I knew back in the second grade. When he got mad, he would bang his head against the wall or the table, whatever was close by and bangable. The rest of us thought it was funny, so we tried to get him mad at every opportunity just to see him do it. I was guilty of it too. See, the teacher moved him around the room, hoping to find the spot where he would be okay. Eventually, he got moved next to me. I remember this time I had grabbed his pencil while he was doing math and pushed down on it just hard enough to break the tip. He got mad, but not that mad. He glared at me and went to sharpen his pencil. When he got back, I waited a minute, then tugged on his paper so his pencil left a streak across the page. He got mad, but not mad enough. So I waited a minute, then I kicked his desk hard enough to send his math book flying off the table and onto the ground. The third time was the charm. He glared at me with crazy eyes, and I remember saying to myself that I had really gone too far. Now he'd go nuts on me, and it would be my own fault. But instead, he began to bang his head against the desk. Everyone was laughing, and the teacher had to wrestle with him to get him to stop. The thing is, we never saw him as a person, just as an object of comic relief. Then one day I saw him in the playground. He was playing all by himself. He seemed fairly content, and it occurred to me that his odd behavior had left him friendless. So friendless that he didn't know any better. I had wanted to go over and play with him, but I was scared. I don't know of what. Maybe that his head banging was contagious, or his friendlessness. I wish I knew where he was today, so I could tell him I understand how it was, and how easy it is to suddenly find yourself alone in the playground. Chapter 61, Czech Brain. Automobile engines aren't all that complicated. They look that way when you don't know much about them, all of those tubes and wires and valves, but mostly the combustion engine hasn't changed all that much since it was invented. My father's issues with cars don't end with plunging rearview mirrors. He basically knows next to nothing about cars, He's all about math and numbers. Cars are just not his thing. Give him a calculator and he can change the world. But whenever the car breaks down and the mechanic asks him what's wrong, his response is usually, "It broke." The automotive industry loves people like my father because it means that they can make lots of money from repairs that the car may or may not need. It annoys my father no end, but he rationalizes it by saying, "We live in a service economy. We all have to feed it somehow." It's not like the car manufacturers are much help. I mean, with modern technology, you'd think our cars could diagnose themselves. But no, all there is in the dashboard is this moronic check engine light that comes on whenever there's anything wrong, which proves that automobiles are more organic than we think. They're obviously modeled on the human brain. There are many ways in which the check brain light illuminates, but here's the screwed up part. The driver can't see it. It's like that the light is positioned in the backseat cup holder beneath an empty can of soda that's been there for a month. No one sees it but the passengers, and only if they're really looking for it, or when the light gets so bright and so hot that it melts the can and sets the whole car on fire. Chapter 95, Windmills of My Mind. How do you explain being there and being here at the same time? It's sort of like those moments when you're thinking about something big that burned itself a powerful memory. Maybe it's the time you scored the winning goal in the playoffs. Or maybe it's the time you got hit by a car on your bike. Good or bad, you're bound to relive it in your head now and then. And sometimes after you've gone there, it's a shock to come back. You have to remind yourself that you're not there anymore. Now imagine being like that all the time, never knowing for sure when you're going to be here or there or somewhere in between. The only thing you have for measuring what's real is your mind. So what happens when your mind becomes a pathological liar? There are the voices and visual hallucinations when it's really bad. But being there isn't about voices or seeing things. It's about believing things. Seeing one reality and believing it's something else entirely. Don Quixote, the famous literary madman, fought windmills. People think he saw giants when he looked at them, but those of us who've been there know the truth. He saw windmills, just like everyone else, but he believed they were giants. The scariest thing of all is never knowing what you're suddenly going to believe. Chapter 108, Up or Drown. No matter how rational the world seems to be, you never really know what crazy crap is around the bend. I saw this in the news once. Some socialite in Manhattan, in a Manhattan high-rise, takes an elevator from the penthouse to the basement garage, dropping down 67 stories, 68 if you count the mezzanine, to get her Mercedes and go to a gallery on Madison Avenue or whatever it is that Manhattan socialites do with their time. What she doesn't know is that a water main burst just a few minutes ago next to her building. So the elevator reaches the basement, and as the doors begin to open, the elevator is flooded by freezing water. What is she going to do? There isn't even a worst-case scenario for this because it's beyond anyone's imagination. In 5 seconds, the water's at her waist, then at her neck, and then she drowns, never knowing what the hell happened or how such a horrific thing is even possible. I mean, think about it. Drowning in an elevator in a skyscraper. That's wrong on 67 different levels, not counting the mezzanine. The weird thing is, hearing stories like this makes me feel a kind of kinship with the Almighty, because it proves that even God has psychotic episodes. Chapter 115, Double, Double, Toil and Trouble, Fire Burn and Cauldron Bubble. About 99% of a pill is made up of other stuff that has nothing to do with the medication. They add extra ingredients for color, coating, and to make the pill stick together. Stuff like xanthan gum, which is made from bacteria, carbobol, which is an acrylic polymer like house paint, and gelatin, which is made from cow cartilage. Somewhere, deep in the secret recesses of Pfizer or GlaxoSmithKline or one of the other big pharmaceutical companies, I imagine there's a high-security dungeon where 3 hunchbacked witches stir a massive industrial cauldron of crap I don't want to know about, but I must ingest on a daily basis. And the generic versions aren't even brewed by real witches. And finally, 139. The rest is silence. If you want to talk about mental misfirings, talk to Shakespeare. My brain fries when I try to read Shakespeare, but my English teacher would not accept "my hound hath eaten my volume" as an acceptable excuse for avoiding Hamlet. Funny thing, after reading for a while, I usually started to understand it. The doomed Prince of Denmark is a dude faced with an impossible choice. The ghost of Hamlet's dead father tells him to avenge his murder by killing his uncle. For the rest of the play, Hamlet agonizes. Should I kill my uncle? Should I ignore the ghost? Is the ghost real? Am I insane? If I'm not insane, should I pretend to be insane? Should I end the agony of impossible choices by ending my life? Will I dream if I kill myself? And will those dreams be any better than the nightmare of my dead father telling me to kill my uncle, who, by the way, is now married to my mother? He agonizes and ponders and talks to himself until he's stabbed by a poisoned blade, and all his tormented self-analysis gives way to eternal silence. Shakespeare had a thing about death, and poison, and insanity. Hamlet's beloved Ophelia really does go insane and drowns. King Lear loses his mind with what we in modern times would call Alzheimer's. Macbeth is totally delusional and has hallucinations of ghosts and a pesky floating dagger. It's all so on target, it makes me wonder if Shakespeare was writing from experience. Regardless, I'm sure people accused him of being on something too.